Do not become partners with those who do not believe. For what partnership is there between righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship does light have with darkness? What agreement does Christ have with Beliar? Or what does a believer share in common with an unbeliever? And what mutual agreement does a temple of God have with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, just as God said, I will live in them and will walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Therefore, come out from their midst and be separate, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing, and I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you will be my sons and daughters, says the all-powerful Lord. Therefore, since we have these promises, dear friends, let us cleanse ourselves from everything that could defile the body and the spirit, and thus accomplish holiness out of reverence for God. Thus Paul writes to the Corinthian Christians in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14 through chapter 7 and verse 1. If you're just joining us, if you have not spent a lot of time in 2 Corinthians, if you're somewhat familiar with Paul's writing, this may not seem very challenging or difficult. It sounds like a standard kind of Pauline exhortation about making sure that they watch their connection with unbelievers and they maintain holiness and righteousness. But where it fits here in 2 Corinthians is a little uneasy, because so far Paul has been first defending his ministry, and then he has been providing these conclusions based upon the defense of his ministry. He's encouraged the Corinthian Christians to open their hearts wide to him, just as he has opened his heart wide toward them. In chapter 7 and verse 2, he's going to then say, make room in your hearts for us, and would again affirm his integrity in all that he has done among them. So we can see that there are very consistent contextual applications before and after this passage. And whereas, sure, the Corinthian Christians living in Corinth would have a lot of temptation, perhaps, to wander off and jointly participate with people and get connected into idolatry, and a concern for holiness is ever present, this hasn't been a predominant theme in 2 Corinthians so far. It truly does seem to come out of nowhere in terms of this particular letter in and of itself. Nothing has really prepared us for this. So this is an interesting situation where really, in the grand scheme of things, this is its own bounded passage. We don't really need to look beforehand in a context or afterward to really try to make sense of it. It's really kind of its own self-contained unit. And that does raise a lot of questions. But what is Paul trying to say here? Well, he is encouraging the Corinthian Christians to not be unequally yoked. The NET is translating as do not become partners with unbelievers. And then he will follow up with a series of rhetorical questions and quotations from the scriptures to reinforce this message. Yokes are used in the ancient world as a wooden bar that would connect two animals together in order to make more effective their work. For instance, two oxen may be yoked together to plow a field or to carry some kind of burden. To be unequally yoked would involve perhaps two different species of animals, two entirely different kind of animals, or even maybe two oxen, but one of them's sick, one of them's much smaller, where there's going to be a big difference, so that there's going to be a lot of harm or damage done to one or both of the animals in trying to maintain that yoke together. It's a very, very visceral image. Now, we need to be careful about unbelievers. And a lot of times people want to get all high and mighty and kind of partisan their definition and say, well, unbelievers are anybody who don't agree with me entirely on Christian doctrine. That is not what Paul is saying here. Paul very much has in mind unbelieving pagans, the ones that are all around them in Corinth at that time. And so we need to be careful about trying to apply it where Paul doesn't want to apply it. And so we have these rhetorical questions. And the idea of the rhetorical questions is they're really leading up to the last two. Especially the last one, right? What partnership can exist between justice, righteousness, or lawlessness? And by definition, of course, none, because if you're being lawless, you're acting contrary to justice and righteousness. What participation can there be between light and darkness? Well, darkness is the absence of light, so therefore none. Therefore, the behavior, same way, right? What agreement could there be between Christ and Beliar? Belial, sons of Belial in Hebrew, here referring to Satan. And of course, from everything we know about their relationship, no, there cannot be any. Therefore, what participation should a believer have with an unbeliever? And what agreement can there be between the temple of God and idols? That's where Paul's really heading here. You should not be unequally committed with unbelievers. And by doing this, he says that, well, we are the temple of the living God, he and the Corinthian Christians. And he goes through all these different quotations, pastiches from the old Hebrew Bibles we're going to see in a minute, in order to reinforce this. Now, this is the third time Paul has called the Corinthian Christians a temple of God. He did that also in 1 Corinthians 3 and 6. And so the first quote that he gives is from Leviticus 26:11 through 12. And these are part of the blessings that God is going to give to the Israelites if they maintain the covenant. And it comes just before all the curses are listed. So it's part of the blessings of the covenant. So the blessing of the covenant that God has made with us means that we are his temple, right? Isaiah 52 is part of the conclusion of a prophetic oracle, and in verse 11, he tells the Jewish people to arise, flee Babylon, to maintain ritual purity, especially those who are carrying the vessels of the temple out back to Israel. And remember, he's already talked in 2 Corinthians 5 about the new creation, how he sees in Jesus' life, death, resurrection, the fulfillment of everything God has promised through Isaiah. And so therefore, to see that the Christians are these holy people who are to depart from the unholy place and to maintain holiness is to help make the case that they are this temple. In Ezekiel 20, part of that promise to restore his people to himself, God promised that he would accept them back with their soothing aroma. Paul paraphrases this, the idea that God would welcome them back to themselves. Very interesting way of doing this is from that I will be their father and they'll be sons and daughters to me. I will be their father and he'll be my son is from 2 Samuel 7:14, where God adopts David's son as his own, i.e. to establish the Davidic line of kings, and of course the discipline would also come with that. But there's nothing about daughters in that passage. That's coming from Isaiah 43, where God would promise to call all the Jewish people his sons and daughters from distant lands and call them back to him. And so, he uses all these quotations, and it is a pastiche. And you can ask, is he misusing these things? He's taking them and he's seeing how they are all going to find their fulfillment. And so you can pull them all together and see that, yes, God has established his presence, which is what a temple is, where a deity has made his manifestation. And so the Corinthians are very familiar with temples. They're all around. That they are now the temple because the Spirit dwells in them. And since they are the temple of the living God, since they are therefore called to be holy, they are not to have any association with these temples of idols. And as a conclusion, in chapter 7 and verse 1, yes, it's chapter 7. This is one of those times where chapter divisions are not great. It should have been probably at the next verse. This verse is definitely part of the theme in verses 14 through 18 of chapter 6. That he calls them dear friends, and he encourages them, based on the promises of God, they should purify themselves from defilements of the flesh and spirit, that so they would perfect holiness in the fear of God. And the promises, of course, all these quotations he's given, but you can also see it in some of the stuff that he talked about in 5 and 6 earlier. And that they are to perfect holiness, which is to bring it to an end, to accomplish it. And again, the idea of holiness is associated with temples because a temple is a consecrated ground for God. It is set apart, which is in Greek hagiosune, which is holy. And that is why the Corinthian Christians need to be holy, because it's no longer about property, it's about people, because God is not dwelling on property, he's dwelling in people. So that's what's going on with this passage. We can explain it, we can make sense of it, we can find parallels to it in a lot of what Paul says in other places. He's already called them the temple of God in 1 Corinthians 3 and 6. He'll talk about holiness and purity in 1 Thessalonians 4. He's talked a lot with the Corinthian Christians about temples and idolatry and resisting glorifying idols in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. So is it Pauline? It sounds like Paul. It certainly does. Some people want to say, well, he uses a lot of words Paul doesn't otherwise use. Well, yeah, this is a lot of words in this passage, or times words Paul only used once. But when Paul does this kind of pastiche and exhortation thing, he tends to use a lot of words that he only uses once. In the themes, we can find it anywhere else in Corinthians, corresponds, let alone in other passages as well. So it certainly sounds like Paul. And we can make sense of it in the context, right? The Corinthian Christians certainly have a lot of idolatry around them. They had concerns about that before in the previous letter. So it's not like it's completely bizarre to think of it. So we can make sense of it here. In fact, it would be hard to make better sense of saying, well, no, someone later just threw it in here, didn't really belong here. Because why would someone do that? What arguments can we make that make sense of why someone would do that? There are times where we can make that kind of argument with other passages, but we can't really make that argument here very well. On the other hand, hopefully we can understand that there is some question about the comfort about the passage here, because as we've been looking at in 2 Corinthians previously, there are times where Paul does have opposition in mind, but it's never been pagan syncretism. It's been mostly about something involving these Jewish Christians from Jerusalem. Yes, we're kind of reading it more as subtext in the first 6 chapters, based upon what we see in chapters 10 through 13, but it's not like it's not there. The temple of the spirit versus the words of the law on the tablets. Some of these other things that he's been kind of zingers he's been throwing out certainly seem to have that reflected. There hasn't been any mention of anything about pagan syncretism anywhere yet in 2 Corinthians. So in a very real way, this concern does come out of the blue in terms of this particular piece of correspondence. And if you read from first kind of response, right? He's gone through this defense of his ministry. He then says, hey, open your hearts wide to us as we've opened our hearts wide to you. He then has this exhortation. Then again, he comes back in 7:2 and 4 says, make room in your hearts for us. We've wronged no one. We've not done anything wrong to you. I'm not saying this to indict you. I'm just saying this because we live and die together, and we want to have overflowing hearts of joy. Which, again, is something we very much can understand from 4, 5, 6. And it will continue to exemplify itself throughout the rest of chapter 7. So this does feel a little weird. This does feel a little odd. This is this kind of its own unit right here. And so what do we make of it? It's definitely from Paul. It's definitely written to the Corinthian Christians. It has contextual applicability. But we need to be careful with how we use it, especially so we don't decontextualize it too much. And so here's an important balance when it comes to the application of this passage. Because the real issue is in its application. Because it is easily decontextualized because, as we saw, it's its own unit. And it even kind of sits somewhat uneasily in its own place. And I want to be very clear. This exhortation has its importance and its purpose, and Christians need to consider it even to this day. We do need to take Paul's concern to heart. We should not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. There are situations in which we can find ourselves in a commitment to unbelievers in a way that is going to induce us to compromise our faith or for us to have our faith ground down. We absolutely need to be that temple of God and to seek holiness, to manifest that kind of holiness, to seek purity, to resist all the defilements of the flesh and the spirit. Those are things we absolutely need to do. We need to keep these things in mind. The challenge comes in when people take this passage and they emphasize it to the neglect and harm of everything else, because there's a lot of abuse that happens with this passage. This is a passage that'll be brought out to say, hey, you should have nothing to do with those unbelievers. You need to completely stay away from unbelievers. See, Paul says, what agreement has unbelievers with believers? What agreement is the temple of God with idols? You need to completely stay away from their defilement. And it can be taken well beyond what is written to contradict other things. We need to remember the very same Paul who wrote this to the Corinthians had said in chapter 5 of the previous letter that he did not tell them at all that to have nothing to do with the sinners in the world. Otherwise, they would have to leave the world, he said. Instead, he said, you should have nothing to do with any so-called believer who participates in sexual morality, idolatry, things like that. Which would not only mean that when it says unequally yoked, we need to take that seriously. That there should not be an unequal partnership. That doesn't mean there's no connection or association at all. It needs to be made sure it's not unequal to a point where you are committed to something you cannot commit yourself to. Remember, the Christians are a minority group, easily oppressed, and the majority culture is going to try to influence them toward these things. All things important to keep in mind. In fact, if you think about it, if you are a Christian and you maintain strong connection with a Christian who is participating in idolatry or sexual morality, you are unequally yoked to a fellow believer. That is an unequal partnership in and of itself, isn't it? So it's not like the unequal yoking is only something that's exclusive to unbelievers. So many times this passage will be used, for instance, in terms of marriage. And there are very important, appropriate applications about marriage, right? There are absolutely times when Christians can become unequally yoked in marriage with an unbeliever. There are maybe examples you know of where there's a faithful Christian who just fell away because of the constant grinding down from that relationship, or caused them nothing but grief in that relationship. On the other hand, to say therefore Christians cannot marry a person who is an unbeliever goes beyond what is written. That is not a restriction that we see. Now, Paul does encourage Christians of the choice of marrying the Lord in 1 Corinthians 7. There's other passages, but Paul said for a believer not to leave an unbeliever if not unnecessary in 1 Corinthians 7:14-15. In 1 Peter chapter 3, that Christian expects, in fact, that wives are often married to husbands who are not Christians. And for that matter, we can absolutely imagine unequal yoking between a Christian and non-Christian, but there are times where somebody who professes to be a Christian, you marry them, and it becomes an unequal yoke because they don't remain faithful or fall away. There are some times where there are unbelieving spouses who may end up being more faithful or better spouses than a potential quote-unquote believing spouse. There's no guarantee in any of these matters. Business partnerships would be another one. Very big concern that Paul would have. If your business, the guilds would often participate in temple cults and idolatry. If you're connected to that, it's going to induce you to some kind of potential sin there. You need to be careful about that. And so we might get the idea, well, we should just stay away from any kind of non-Christian business association. We don't want to get taught up with people who don't have the same ethics as we do. And that might be a concern in many places. And we need to be careful that we do not become so committed in a business context with people that it leads us to commit these various kinds of sins. On the other hand, it's not like always working with Christians makes everything better. Now, there are some Christians who work well together in a business. They glorify God in that business. They're in fact able to maybe encourage people in the faith and encourage themselves in their faith because of their work together in business. But what happens when those business ventures go wrong? And it can cause a lot of damage and difficulty in churches as well. The point of this matter is to realize that Paul has an exhortation here that is very important, but that it is not the last word on these subjects. And that we need to be careful about overusing this passage, overemphasizing this passage, because a lot of times this passage can be overused and abused to try to justify a circle of the wagons mentality, to have people try to cut off all their non-believing friends. It can be used in a very cultic way that does not really lead to holiness. It leads to manipulation and control. And the fruit of that can be manifest and evident. That doesn't mean that we dismiss the passage entirely, or that we just always look at the passage only in terms of its abuse, because it exists for important reasons, and those reasons need to be remembered. We do need to strive for holiness. We do need to strive to remove the defilements that would defile our bodies or our spirits. We need to represent those temples of the living God and not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. And yet we still need to live in the world. And yet we still need to have some association with believers, just not an unequal yoke in those situations. We need to navigate the whole counsel of God, because the sum of God's word is truth. And we need to hold the tension that exists between the fact that we live among unbelievers, and yet we're not to be unequally yoked with them. That we're not to be defiled by the defilements of the world, and yet we are to live in the world. That we are to seek holiness and righteousness, but also realizing that it is a purity that we have comes because Jesus has suffered and died for us and has cleansed us through his blood. And we have maintained that because of our trust in him. All these things are held in tension, and therefore we need to understand the dimensions of this exhortation and keep these exhortations in mind. And at different times and situations in our lives, we're going to need to maybe emphasize or focus on one over the other, but never to the neglect or suppression of the other. So in some situations, we might do better to remember that we need to be unequal, not to avoid being unequal with unbelievers. Other times, remember, no, we need to have some connection with outsiders. We just need to be careful. But we do need to make sure we're not unequally yoked with unbelievers. We need to make sure that we are striving toward that lack of defilement and purity as the temple of God to accomplish holiness in the fear of God. That is absolutely something we all need to do and to keep in mind as we seek to glorify and honor Jesus. We're so glad you've joined us. If you have any questions, comments, or thoughts about anything we've talked about, 2 Corinthians 6:14 7:1, we'd love to hear about it. Let us know and continue our conversation in the comments. I'm Ethan with the Venice Church of Christ. We'd love to be of encouragement service to you. Please reach out to us if we can be of any kind of service at VeniceChurchofChrist.org. You can also find us online at Venice Church or Venice Church of Christ and many social media sites. We again thank you. May the Lord bless and keep you, make his face to shine upon you until we're able to meet again.